So that's exegesis. And again, when we come to the Scriptures, we are seeking to exegete, to draw out the meaning of the text. And we'll be doing some of that tonight, as you'll see. And then the word that we've had a number of times, science. Webster's defines science as knowledge about the natural world that is based on facts learned through experiments and observations. So the question will be tonight is the use of science. So with those two words in the background, there's the evolutionary timeline that we've looked at a number of times. So 13.7 billion years ago, there's this big bang. Stars begin to form 13.2 billion years ago. You know the whole story. There's over 13 billion years from the start of the creation to the introduction of man upon this planet. That is extremely different than what we find in the Scriptures, where we find in 6 literal days God created everything. Not beginning with the Big Bang and not beginning with stars and not ultimately ending up with our sun and then not finally getting to earth, but starting with earth, the big blue ball covered with water. And so we looked last week at those 6 literal days, and we'll develop this out some more tonight. So, science does not produce ages. If we push science for the age of people or the age of things, we must remember that there are limitations. When you go to the doctor and the doctor asks how old you are, he is expecting you not to pull out some scientific information to him to attempt to derive your age, but rather he's seeking for you to tell him your age. Science does not produce ages like that. It can only produce a minimum or a maximum, or in some case, a range. Can you imagine that if you went to the doctor and he decided he was going to figure out how old you were? So he drew some blood, he took a snapshot of your teeth, he measured your bones, and he said, well, you're somewhere between 25 and 35. Okay, let's get going. That's not what science does as a general business. That's not observable, measurable science. If it attempts to do this, it makes assumptions about the past that must hold true for that age, whether it's the minimum age, a maximum age, or an age range to be true. Whether you know those assumptions or not, there are always assumptions if science is producing an age. And then finally, as those assumptions break down or as those assumptions are violated, that age, min, max, or range, can become completely erroneous. Science was not designed to produce ages. If you want the age of something, you're not looking for science or a scientist. What are you looking for? You're looking for history, right? You're looking for history. You're looking for a birth certificate. You're looking for written history. Good news, I happen to know of some written history that talks about the age of the creation. So we're in luck tonight. I happen to know of some. The Bible provides us that. We'll start here tonight. But again, we won't end here because I need you and I to be prepared to interact with a culture who, for the most part, no longer accept the Bible, who no longer see it as God's Word. So if you would, grab a Bible and let's turn to chapter 5 and look at how God describes the age of this creation or the age of the earth. And so I'll give you a minute. Genesis, I believe is it the first one? Jay, first book in the Bible? Yeah, first book. So Genesis, flip over if you will to chapter 5. And go to verse 1. We'll just start reading right there. Moses writing as God's giving him the words to write, no doubt. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them and called them mankind in the day that they were created. We're looking at the book of the genealogy of Adam. A book that lays out a clear genealogy from Adam, who was created on day 6. We can just wipe that out and say created in the beginning, all the way to Jacob, as he's in captivity in Egypt. That's the time frame that the book of Genesis lays out clearly for us. Verse 3, and Adam lived 130 years, and he begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. And he begat Seth. After he begat Seth, the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. Now we all know Seth was not the firstborn son, but Seth was the patriarch who was marking the lineage that's going to be laid out in Genesis. That's how Genesis lays this out. To give you the model, this patriarchal model, we saw it with Adam. His birth, in this case, that'd be day 6 if you're being exact. We'll just call it in the beginning. 130 years later, he fathers Seth. That's the marker. So there's 130 years, and the next patriarch steps into the scene. He lives an additional 800 years, and then he finally passes away at a ripe old age of 930 years. If you're still in Genesis 5, And by the way, there are a few exceptions to that perfect model, but that, 930 years. Yep, my wife would be tired of me by then. Okay, so verse 6. Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. After he begot Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had sons and daughters. You see the model replicating itself as it rolls out. You have this on your sheet. This is the model if you were to trace this out from Adam all the way to Joseph in Israel or in Egypt. So I'll let you take that in. A couple of things should probably become pretty self-evident as you glance at it. The flood occurred 1,656 years after the creation. No doubt about it. The Bible lays it out crystal clear. It was the 600th year of Noah's life when the flood came upon the earth. And by the way, we'll spend a couple of weeks on the flood. Notice what happened. All the patriarchs, unless something was going on, were living around 900 years, but it ended with Noah. He was the last patriarch to live that long. And starting with Seth, his son, the ages began to diminish. For initially a few hundred years, and then with each successive generation, it continued to decrease. Now that has to be somehow created to the flood. You see what happened. Noah lived that, he was the last one that lived that long time. So however you explain it, you need something that happened immediately and something that continued to happen, that changed the lifespan of man upon this earth. By the way, according to Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, the name Methuselah means when he dies, it comes. Well, interestingly enough, Methuselah died the year of the flood. When he died, turns out it came. This is a beautiful time chart that takes you really all the way to Israel in Egypt in one chapter of the book. Now, if you take this and you plot, and that's a terrible picture, you probably can't read it, but what I've laid out for you is really the history from the creation all the way to Jesus Christ. Now, it's debatable how long that is, and let me tell you the subject of the debate. It's somewhere between 4,220 years and 4,004 years, depending on how you age some of the things that happen along the way of the Exodus and the Kings. But everything from creation, and you need to see this, according to the Scriptures, from the creation to Jesus Christ coming into the world, happened in 4,200 years or less. Somewhere between 4,200 and 4,000 if you're trying to get it, if you're taking the Bible's chronology and laying it out. But the truth is, you don't even have to do that. Luke does this for us in the Gospel of Luke. He lays this out from Adam all the way to the Messiah. He lays out a lineage, and there's all the generations that come to Jesus Christ. And if you trace those out biblically until you get to the ones that you can't trace, you're going to end up with a creation that's greater than 6,000 and less than 7,000. You're going to end up with a story where Jesus came on the scene sometime between 4,000 and 4,200 years after creation. Now, just to say a couple things about this, if you've ever looked at the genealogies laid out in Luke and Matthew, you would probably recognize they're very different. There are a couple of theories here, but let me tell you what I think is the correct one. And Pastor may correct me, but I'll tell you what I think. I think when you read Luke, which starts with Adam and goes all the way to the Christ, you are reading the lineage of Mary. When you read Matthew, Matthew starts the lineage with Abraham, but that's because he's doing it in groups of 14 generations. He says from Abraham to David, 14 generations. From David to the captivity, 14 generations. From the captivity to Christ, 14 generations. And that's why he picks his up that way, highlighting that number 14. And we talked about that in our Sunday school class. What's interesting, if you look at the lineage as recorded by Matthew, which indeed is probably the lineage of Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, it traces through every Judean king. Joseph was in the kingly line, which means his firstborn son was rightly king. Oh, he was the king of glory. He was the creator of all things, but he was the king in fulfillment of prophecy from the Judea line. Equally, regardless of which line you trace, whether you trace Mary's, if indeed what I'm saying is correct, or whether you trace Joseph's, all of them fulfill the prophecies in the Old Testament about genealogy. The prophecies were that the Messiah would come from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob, from Judah, and from David. And whether you trace his earthly mom's lineage or his earthly dad's lineage, you will find both fulfill the requirements of prophecy. That is rather, to pick a word, Derek, amazing and incredible. But that's not our lesson for tonight. But it's easy to see, if you believe what Luke says about genealogy, that's everyone from Adam all the way to Christ in one slide. More than 6,000, less than 7,000. No other way. So the biblical timeline, if we were to expand it a little bit, you have day one, about 1,656 years exactly. You have the flood, around 2,730 years, the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, around 4,250 years at the end of Christ's life, he's executed at Golgotha at Calvary. That's the biblical timeline as we continue to develop it. So the Bible demands a very young earth, greater than 6,000, less than 7,000. So your question for me should be, how in the world can that be? If the earth is really 6,000 or 7,000, where are we getting the idea that this planet, according to the Big Bang, is 4.5 billion years old? So now to our question. Can observable, measurable science help answer the age of the earth or the age of the creation? I believe it can. And that's what we're going to spend the next 3 weeks on, is me showing you those points. Now at this point, maybe you're thinking, Rich, who cares about the age of the creation? What is it in the end, Pastor, what does it matter? Well, I would say this. First, the credibility of the book of Genesis is at stake. The question is, does day mean day? And can we read these genealogies and expect them to really be true? Or is this complete fabrication? I would say point number one, the book of Genesis is at stake. But it's bigger than that. The credibility of Jesus is at stake. He's the one who said, in the beginning, God created them male and female. If he means billions of years separating the beginning and the creation of man, his credibility is at stake. And let's be honest, once we have Genesis and Jesus' credibility at stake, the stake of the entire Bible, the credibility of the entire Bible is at stake. But now let's be honest about one other thing that's at stake. The theory of evolution is at stake. Because let's be honest, if you don't have 4.5 billion years to hide all this magic in, this is more like a fairy tale than science. If you need 4.5 billion years to hide the magic of molecule to man evolution, because no one will buy the story if it's less than 7,000 years. So the theory of evolution, in all honesty, is absolutely at stake. So science cannot give an exact age of the earth. Only the Bible can do that, but science can show limits, and that's what we'll talk about tonight. So tonight, just a little jump around our solar system real quick, just a couple things to look at. The next few video clips are from Spike Psaris. If you were with us in some of the earlier lessons, he spoke. This is a 3-part DVD series entitled What You Aren't Being Told About Astronomy. So our first stop is Mercury. That's the smallest planet in our solar system. It's only slightly larger than our moon, really. It orbits the sun every 88 days in a very elliptical orbit, the largest elliptical orbit of all the planets. What's amazing is this in a 3-2 spin orbit resonance with the sun. You're thinking, what did he just say? So it's rotating around the sun every 88 days, but it's in a 3-2 spin orbit resonance. That means for every 2 times around, which would be like a year if you lived on Mercury, the planet rotates just 3 times. No other planet in our solar system does anything like this. It's close to what the moon does, but picture that. So a year is 88 days, and if you live there for 2 years, you would enjoy 3 full days. That's how it works. That's how slow it is rotating in that spin orbit resonance with the sun. Mercury's a place, as you might imagine, of extremes. On the bright side, on the near side, on the heated side, which is rotating very slowly, but while it's heated, temperatures get in excess of 800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead. On the dark side or the far side, temperatures plummet to minus 280 degrees Fahrenheit. You probably would not make it on Mercury. But there's something else about Mercury that's really cool. It defies evolutionary processes, and it declares itself to be a young planet.
Then, in 2008, the Messenger spacecraft arrived at Mercury, our first in-depth study of the planet in over 30 years, and we got a treasure trove of new information. Evolutionists had hoped that the new data would solve their problems. Instead, the problems became far worse. Messenger created several new challenges for secular models. First of all, Messenger found that Mercury has a lot of volatile elements, like sulfur and potassium. This discredits the large impact hypothesis because these elements are very volatile. A violent collision like this would have vaporized these elements. They would have escaped into space, and they wouldn't be on Mercury today. But they are on Mercury today. Therefore, there was no large impact, and evolutionists can no longer explain Mercury's large metallic core. Second, Mercury appears to have lots of sulfur, a higher concentration than any other rocky planet. This sulfur causes other problems for evolutionary models. The nebula theory says that volatile elements like sulfur can't be there. As one study noted, chemical condensation models indicate that sulfur cannot condense in the primordial solar nebula at the heliocentric distance of Mercury. But there it is on Mercury anyway. Third, Messenger found that Mercury's magnetic field is decaying. It decreased by almost 8% in just 35 years or so. At this rate, it loses half its strength about every 320 years. If Mercury were really billions of years old, it shouldn't have a magnetic field at all. Now we see that it not only has a field, the field is also decaying rapidly. This makes the field look very young, like the planet was initially magnetized just a few thousand years ago. It can't have been decaying like this for billions of years, because it would have been impossibly strong far less than 1 million years ago. By the way, the decaying field was not a surprise to creationists, because a physicist named Dr. Russell Humphreys had predicted it ahead of time, based on the creation account in the Bible.
So Mercury defies evolutionary processes, but the magnetic field and the rapidly decaying magnetic field prove beyond any doubt that it's a very young planet. Let's take a stop here at really the planet we're most familiar with, the Earth, and our single satellite, the Moon. Obviously, we're the third planet from the Sun. The pastor talked about the Moon. It helps with tidal effects on our planet. It stabilizes our spin on our axis. Our average distance from the Sun is about 93 million miles. That's referred to, if you've ever heard it referred to, as an astronomical unit. Light takes 8 minutes to get here from the Sun at 93 million miles. So when you see a solar flare, you're seeing one that occurred 8 minutes ago. About 71% of the Earth is covered with water. And as I said in other lessons, if we were to flatten out the Earth, the depth of the water would be 1.4 miles. So if you're wondering where did all the water go from the flood, it's right there. Right still on the planet. It's here, 1.4 miles if you flatten this place out. But like Mercury, the Earth and the Moon defy evolutionary processes and declare themselves to be young.
Let's talk instead about the Earth as a planet. Other than its age, does it match evolutionary theories? No, in many ways it doesn't. First of all, Earth's magnetic field causes all sorts of problems for evolution. Our magnetic field looks sort of like the field that would be generated if there was a giant bar magnet inside the Earth. Of course, there is no bar magnet inside of our planet. So where does the field come from? We've already discussed how magnetic fields are supposedly generated by fluid motions inside the planets. We've also discussed how this idea doesn't necessarily work, especially for Mercury. Well, it's hard to make it work for the Earth too, even though the Earth is the planet it was invented to explain. The American Geophysical Union website quotes a study that says this: "The mechanism for generating the geomagnetic field remains one of the central unsolved problems in geoscience." An even bigger problem, though, is that our magnetic field is decaying. For as long as we've been measuring it, its energy has fallen continuously. It loses half its energy about every 1,400 years or so. Now, you might have heard that the Earth's magnetic field has flipped in the past, that north and south magnetic poles have swapped. That's true, but it's not what we're talking about here. We aren't talking about the strength of the field at any one place on the Earth. We're talking about all the energy in the field overall, and that energy is fading fast. Since it's getting weaker over time, this means it was stronger in the past. If you could travel backwards in time, the field would double its energy every 1,400 years you traveled. Of course, there's a definite limit on how strong it could possibly have been. It turns out that the Earth's magnetic field could only be tens of thousands of years old at the most, not thousands of millions. Oh, and evolutionary dynamo theories can't explain any of this, of course. That's why one evolutionist recently wrote, "Magnetism is almost as much of a puzzle now as it was when William Gilbert wrote his classic text concerning magnetism, magnetic bodies, and the great magnet Earth in 1600. So, despite 400 years of research, evolutionists can't figure out how the Earth could possibly have a magnetic field. Maybe we should just accept that our planet was created?
So if you play the field back far enough, beyond 20,000 years, you end up with a magnetic field so strong that it would pull the iron out of your body. So obviously, the magnetic field is declaring that the Earth is a very young planet. But the moon is the next one on the list. Obviously, 240,000 miles from planet Earth. It is our single satellite. It's the 5th largest satellite in our solar system. The largest is Ganymede. Now, what's interesting about the moon is it looks like it's not rotating. It's in what's called a synchronous rotation with the Earth. So what that means is as it's rotating around the Earth, it's revolving. And those things are so close together that it gives the appearance that it's not rotating, even though it is rotating while it's revolving in a 27-day cycle. It's the only planet in our solar system that does that. Pretty cool. But beyond just being cool, it too defies evolutionary processes, and it too proves itself to be a young moon.
All along, there's been a lot of evidence that the moon can't be billions of years old. For example, this is the Aristarchus Plateau. This is one of many locations on the moon that have been controversial for a long time. For centuries, people have seen flashes and temporary glows of light in these locations. These events don't last long, so it's been very difficult to photograph them. But we have written accounts of them going back to the 1500s. It seems that the moon is still geologically active, releasing gas from volcanic vents. This is the Eratosthenes crater, another location where unusual sightings have occurred. Evolutionists have rejected all these sightings as nonsense. In their models, the moon's volcanic activity stopped about 3.2 billion years ago. The moon is old, cold, and dead. It can't be geologically active, or so they've always said. Finally, though, all the accumulating evidence became too much. In 1968, NASA released its chronological catalog of reported lunar events. This report listed 579 separate sightings of anomalous events on the moon. A couple of years later, the Apollo 15 mission even measured radon gas coming from the Aristarchus crater. Apparently, the moon is still geologically active. This makes perfect sense if it was only a few thousand years old. It's not old, cold, and dead after all. The funny thing is, for the most part, evolutionists still won't admit any of this. In 2006, a study was published that said, well, we used to think that all geological activity stopped there 3.2 billion years ago, but now we admit we were wrong. It continued until 10 million years ago. They just have to stick with the millions of years. They just can't admit that the moon is young and that its geological activity is still going on today. After all, if the moon was young, then the Bible would be right, and they don't want that. There's still one final problem with the evolutionist model that we haven't discussed yet. When our astronauts went to the moon, they brought lots of experiments with them. One of those experiments was called LLR, or Lunar Laser Ranging. These were special mirrors that the astronauts left behind on the moon. These are the locations where the Apollo missions landed. Apollo 11, 14, and 15 were the 3 missions that left behind the LLR reflectors. The reflectors look like this. Scientists on the Earth can fire a laser at one of these reflectors, and if the laser hits the target directly, which is really hard to do, as you can imagine, but they are able to do this, then the laser bounces back to Earth. Scientists then measure how long the light took to return, and then they figure out exactly how far away the moon is from us. This is still being done today, by the way. It's the only Apollo experiment that's still going on. Here's why this is important. Scientists have discovered that the moon is moving further away from us every year. This was already suspected before Apollo, but now we've been able to measure it. So why is this happening? Is it because the moon is raising ocean tides on the Earth? This causes our ocean to bulge towards the moon. However, the Earth is spinning underneath the bulge and pulling it forward. The bulge itself then exerts a gravitational pull on the moon, which accelerates it and moves it outward in its orbit. That's a complicated process, but don't worry about the details. The important part is this. The moon is moving away from the Earth at about 3.8 centimeters per year. That's about 1.5 inches each year. We've measured this for years, and we know exactly why it's happening. 1.5 inches per year doesn't sound like much, but the way this works, it would have been receding faster in the past. Looking backwards in time, the moon would have been much closer to the Earth than today. In fact, calculations show that the moon would have been touching the Earth only 1.5 billion years ago. Obviously, this is impossible. Obviously, the moon can't have been orbiting the Earth for 4 billion years, as evolutionists claim. By the way, I should mention that evolutionists have been trying to solve this problem. There are some articles floating around on the internet that say this isn't a problem for evolution anymore. But those articles are wrong. If you're curious why, you can go to www.creationastronomy.com for details.
So this is the near side of the moon, the side that faces us. You can see those large impact craters. They refer to those as seas, but they're areas where things have hit the moon so hard that it caused fresh lava to flow and resurface portions of the moon. This is the dark side of the moon. This is the side that doesn't face the Earth. It has numerous small impact craters, as one might expect, but amazingly enough, it doesn't have but just one sort of large impact crater where lava flowed, where the side facing us, the side you would think is very protected because the Earth is protecting it, is more damaged than the side that faces outer space. Right, Roy? How in the world can that be? Well, we'll talk more about that later. Okay, this is the article that talked about the moon recessing out of impact. Inch and a half a year. It's no big deal until you start playing it backwards over a very long time. At 1.5 million years, it's rolling around like a marble on the surface of the Earth. That's not going to work. All research and all studies show at about 11,500 miles from the Earth, when it's that close, it would actually tear the moon apart and it would bombard the Earth. So obviously that does not work either. So there's the recession of the moon. Again, no more than 1 billion years old. Impossible. Now this does explain what happened to the tall dinosaurs. They got mooned to death. Okay, just kidding. Sorry. Okay, so Uranus and Neptune, we'll end with these two planets, and I just have some closing thoughts. They too, in a major way, defy evolutionary processes and show themselves to be very young gas giants.
We've seen that over and over again, the magnetic field and the solar system have falsified evolutionary models. Well, Neptune is no different. We had a hint of the problem already before our first spacecraft even reached Neptune. When Voyager 2 was on its way to Neptune, it visited Uranus first. I already told you that according to evolution, Uranus wasn't supposed to have much of a magnetic field, but it does. There was another surprise, though, that I didn't mention. Not only was Uranus's magnetic field much stronger than the evolutionists expected, it was also tilted and offset from the center of the planet. Evolutionists couldn't make sense of this at all. It doesn't match their models at all. So they scratched their heads and said, well, maybe Voyager flew by just as Uranus's magnetic field was reversing. This would have been very unlikely, although not impossible. But then, 3 years later, Voyager arrived at Neptune, and guess what? Neptune's magnetic field is also tilted and offset from the planet's center. Evolutionists were forced to acknowledge that it seems that the possibility of finding two planets both experiencing magnetic polarity reversals is small. So far, we've seen that Neptune has produced lots of bad news for the evolutionary model. But there's an even bigger problem that I haven't told you about yet. According to evolutionary models, Neptune can't exist at all. Here's how Astronomy Magazine explained it. Psst. Astronomers who model the formation of a solar system have kept a dirty little secret. Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Or at least computer simulations have never explained how planets as big as the two gas giants could form so far from the Sun. Bodies orbited so slowly in the outer parts of the Sun's protoplanetary disk that the slow process of gravitational accretion would need more time than the age of the solar system to form bodies with 14.5 and 17.1 times the mass of Earth. Did you catch that? According to evolution, Uranus and Neptune don't exist. Well, last time I checked, both planets were still up there in the sky. Evolutionists are unhappy that their model is such a failure. As one evolutionary astronomer has commented, what is clear is that simple banging together of planetesimals to construct planets takes too long in this remote outer part of the solar system. The time needed exceeds the age of the solar system. We see Uranus and Neptune, but the modest requirement that these planets exist has not been met by this model. Let's ask an important question here. How long has this problem been known? Here's another evolutionist. There have been many attempts to model the evolution of a swarm of colliding planetesimals. Safronov calculated the characteristic timescales for planetary growth. In the terrestrial region, he found timescales of 10 to the 7 years. That's a 1 with 7 zeros after it. But the time estimates increased rapidly in the outer regions of the solar system and was 10 to the 10 years for Neptune, which is twice the age of the solar system. It is clear that in view of the large timescales found for the formation of the outer planets, a satisfactory theoretical model for the accretion of planets from diffuse material is not available at present. Okay, so this problem was first discovered by a scientist named Safronov. Was this a recent discovery? Nope. Safronov published this in 1972, so evolutionists have known for over 30 years that Uranus and Neptune can't exist, according to their models. Did you hear about this in Time magazine, or in the newspaper, or in a science program? I bet you haven't. In fact, I bet you've been told the opposite. I bet you've been told that evolutionists had the entire solar system figured out, and that they know exactly how it all formed all by itself billions of years ago. Now you know that this is a falsehood.
So I have a theory. The reason Mercury appears young, the reason the Earth appears young, the reason the Moon appears young, the reason Neptune appears young, the reason Uranus appears young is because they're young. But I think we knew this, right? I think we knew this when we were looking at the genealogy in Genesis. I think we knew this when we were looking at the genealogy in Matthew and Luke. I think we knew this. I want to close with this thought. This is Jesus speaking. For had you believed Moses, you would have believed me, for he wrote of me. But if you believe not his writings, how shall you believe my words? Jesus said, if you'll believe Moses, you're likely to believe me. But the opposite is true as well. If you reject what Moses says, you're likely to reject what I say.